All right, we'll go ahead and get started tonight. Good to see everybody, and we'll go to the Lord in prayer first of all, and ask the Lord to help us tonight. I'll give a little update. My wife texted me and said her mom seemed to be doing pretty good, but they'd come in and given her Lasix because she's got all that fluid, and for the congestive heart failure. So just continue to pray for her and my wife, if you would. So we'd appreciate that. So let's go to the Lord in prayer. Father, we just thank you for your blessings, and I'm thankful for thy word. And I pray and I ask that you would help us as we look tonight and study about church history. I pray, Lord, that you would allow it to be a blessing to us, to be an encouragement. Lord, as we look at these great examples and what others have gone through and how it formed and shaped their lives, Lord, may it shape our lives as well for your honor and for your glory. And we ask for your safety on our lives as we go home in a little while, be with our families, those that are sick, those that have lost loved ones. Lord, we pray for them, and I'm thankful for answered prayer, and I'm thankful for the opportunity to be here tonight. We ask these things in Jesus' name, and amen. All right, after Brother Forbes' lesson, see, that makes me self-conscious about how I'm moving and stuff, so try not to pick up any bad habits. That's one of the reasons the Lord gives you a wife. She'll help you. You know, my wife, she tells me all the time what I'm doing wrong, and if I say something wrong, you can preach for 50 minutes and nobody can remember what you preached on an hour later, but you say something wrong and everybody heard it. Well, that's just part of it. It's probably not that bad, but anyway, we're left off last week looking at the life of George Whitefield. And tonight I want to start with Psalms 85, verse number 6, because this goes right along with what we're studying about. And I'm sure you might be familiar with that verse where the Bible says, "Wilt thou not revive us again, that thy people may rejoice in thee?" And we're getting ready to get into the chapter on the Great Awakening. And one thing about church history, when you study church history, studying church history is also a study of the history of revival. And that ought to be something that we're very interested in, is the subject of revival. Now, you think about the Great Awakening and other great revivals that have gone on in our country. If we could go back in time, what would it have been like? I try to think about that a lot of times. What would it have been like to live in the early 1700s, prior to 1734? If we were living at that time, and maybe we just could just go back and observe, I wonder if we would think that a great revival is getting ready to start. Just by looking and observing the people, the churches, the society, people's attitudes, even what was going on politically. I wonder if you'd get the impression or the feeling, I think we're getting ready to have a great revival. Probably not. And I want to give you 6 or 7 or 8 things about that we could say some of the characteristics of what it was like in America prior to the Great Awakening. It'd be sort of like today. If you only looked at the newspaper, the news, if you looked around at what's been going on some of the protests that's been going on in our country, some of the college campuses, I've read several stories about after the election that so many people are upset and they're going out and they are protesting and they are stopping traffic on the highways and disrupting businesses and all of these things in some of these college campuses. In fact, coming to school tonight, I heard that the University of Michigan had canceled plans to they were going to what was it they were going to do? They were providing coloring books, Play-Doh, and something else to help the students deal with. It was Play-Doh coloring books and hot chocolate. I can't remember. Bring puppies and let them pet them. I don't know, but it was something that you just hear. You hear it and you say, was they really going to do that?
Yeah.
They really going? Is that what it's come to in this country? Now, if that's all you had to look at in our country, would you think that there was any opportunity that we could have revival? I mean, from a human, fleshly standpoint, I tell you, it looks pretty bleak. Looks pretty dark sometimes. But if you study history and you go back to just before the Great Awakening, you'd probably come to the same conclusion. There's no way that we could have revival. So let me give you a few things that were going on prior to the Great Awakening. Number one, there was persecution of the true church. Now, there was a lot of religion, and religion was just, Americans were religious. It was more, it was very popular to be religious. But the true church was being persecuted. And what I mean by that, true believers. And how sad to think about people that claim to be Christians persecuting other Christians. But we've already seen several examples. Roger Williams, he was banished to the wilderness. John Clark, Thomas Gold, the beating of Obadiah Holmes, others we've looked at. So there was people, they were really suffering. I mean, really, their faith was being put to the test. If you were imprisoned, if your land was confiscated, if you were fined for your faith, beaten, you'd think, boy, things are bad, and that would be bad. And it talks about it in this book. The beginning of chapter number 6 has got a paragraph or a little excerpt there at the very, very beginning, and it's on page probably 107. It's right across from the picture of George Whitefield. And that quote by Solomon Payne, he says, "I cannot but marvel to see how soon the children will forget the sword that drove their fathers into this land, and take hold of it as a jewel, and kill their grandchildren therewith. Oh, that men could see how far this is from Christ's rule." And so it was common that persecution was taking place. And we're not to that point yet in America, but most Bible-believing Christians, they feel the pressure of society, the pressure of government, the pressure of laws, things along these lines. So that doesn't bode well for Christian people. There's persecution. Number two, not only persecution of the true church, but there was government-sanctioned persecution, meaning it wasn't just what I mean is that the government was a church-state relationship. So not only was, say, the Puritans persecuting, well, they were not only religious, but they also represented the government. So you didn't just have it from one side, you were getting it from both sides. The constable, the magistrate, the governor on one side, and then you had the black hats, you had the town council, you was getting it from all directions. And so there was this persecution that was going on by the government. Remember when we studied about the first church at Boston, and for 50 years, I mean, it was just one thing after another, condemned the building, forbid them to meet together, arrest the preacher, and on and on and on it went. Another thing that was going on during that time was formalism. Formalism is what the Bible is talking about in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse number 5, where it talks about having a form of godliness but denying the power thereof. And so formalism is just going through the motions. And there was a lot of formalism. There was religion with no power. And we have the same thing in America today. You have a lot of churches, you have a lot of religion, you have a lot of going through the motions of things. The Congregational church, the Puritan church, they had a lot of ceremony. They had a prayer book, so they had a service that they went through. That was their reading. They had infant baptism. They had communion every Sunday. They went through all these religious motions, but many times there was no power. There was no meaning in it, really. Remember, I was talking a week or two ago. They were talking about the subject of unconverted ministers. That you could actually have somebody as the pastor of a church that wasn't even saved and didn't even claim to be saved. That's formalism. That's dead works is all that is. And the pulpit ministries were influenced more by the mind than they were the spirit or the soul. And it was an intellectual exercise a whole lot of times. And the downfall of a lot of these denominations is that they place more emphasis on the mind than they did the spirit. And for example, some of the Presbyterians, some of the Methodist churches, they started to require that their ministers would have a formal seminary education, and that sort of rang the death bell for the fire and the fervency that they had. And that has even happened in Baptist churches and I've heard it a lot of times when I was a younger preacher. I was told, in fact, some of my family were against going to school. And they said there's been a lot of preachers went off to school and lost their fire and lost their zeal. Well, it really would just depend on where you went and who you listened to. But this formalism, this intellectualism, and that was across the board. The Puritans, the Presbyterians, the Congregationalists, and even some of the Baptists of that time, even though they were struggling to even make it, they fell into this formalism. And so that is one of the primary characteristics of the days before the Great Awakening. And then number 4, there was an apostasy. They placed more on the doctrines of men than the doctrines of God, this thing of infant baptism. And some of them called that the badge of the great whore. Didn't find that anywhere in the Bible, and they were persecuting people over not bringing their child to be baptized. And that's apostasy, going away from the truths of God's Word. They had infant baptism. We've studied about this halfway covenant, and coming up with all of these things that you have no basis in the Bible whatsoever. That's apostasy. And so there was apostasy. There was immorality. We're going to get into studying about George Whitefield. And he said that before he was converted, you might think to yourselves, well, what could they have gotten into way back then? Man has always been sinful. And it's easy for him to get into sin. And George Whitefield, I was reading about him, his testimony before he was converted. He said he was a card player and a romance novel reader and a theater goer and a Sabbath breaker. And I mean, just because they didn't have TV doesn't mean they couldn't get into sin. And they did. There was a lot of immorality. George Whitefield, when he went through North Carolina, he said that you could always find a dance, and you could find a dance in North Carolina, but you could rarely find a prayer meeting. And George Whitefield and John Wesley came to America, and when they came to America, they talked about coming to the heathen. From England, they were missionaries, what we would say missionaries. They was coming to America because America had a bunch of heathens. There was immorality, and there's always been. But there was certainly immorality that was going on. There was much divisiveness, number 6. There was a lot of division. There was division between the religions and the denominations and the religious leaders. There was divisions within the churches, and we'll touch on that again, but we mentioned last week there was the the old lights and the new lights. And so even in churches, we talked about in Jonathan Edwards' church, that all the years that he pastored there, I don't think he had any peace. There were some that was for him, there were some that was against him, and in the end they voted him out and broke his heart after serving all those years. There was divisiveness in the churches, divisiveness spiritually speaking, but there was also divisiveness politically speaking. And this is leading up to the time where talk is starting to come about that America should divide or should separate from England. And most of the people didn't think that was a good idea. You know, that's if you think about early America, the great majority of the colonists, well, they all came from England. They all came from Europe. They came from some from Germany and places like that, but the majority of them came from England. And so they're not going to be very much inclined to separate from their mother country. You know, they've still got grandmothers and grandpas and cousins and aunts and uncles that lives in England. That's the only government that most of them have ever known. And so the majority of the country was at first not for separating. And then some were for separating. And just like in our day and time, a whole lot of people could care less one way or the other. And so there was division in the country. There was apathy. Let's see, page number 99 talks about Jonathan Edwards being concerned about the young people and speaking to them. It's in the middle of the page there. It said, but to the surprise of everyone, the young people, or let's see, let me back up a little bit. He challenged his people to warn their families, but to the surprise of everyone, the young people were already discussing their mediocrity and repenting of their complacency. God began to move in their midst. And so Jonathan Edwards was concerned about the young people, and when it's talking about their complacency and their mediocrity, what that means is just apathy. You know, we have that today. A very common phrase is whatever. You know, whatever. We don't care. That's apathy. That's, you know, or care less. And so they had that was going on. And on page 104 it said this. It said a preacher at that time said the churches are asleep. Only a loud voice can wake them out of it. And so we have apathy today, not just among the young people, but among a whole lot of people. You know, well, whatever. You know, if we have revival, if we don't, if people get saved, if they don't, it's a hard time. We're in the last days, blah, blah, blah. You hear stuff like that. And then I thought this was interesting. A contributing factor, we might say, was the subject of they begin to think they were under the judgment of God. If you look on page 100, where it says, what is the ground of thy controversy? There were several things that happened in New England that caused people to think that maybe they were in the last days, that they were under the judgment of God, that these bad things that were happening were God trying to get their attention. And I'm not going to read all of this, but just I've underlined it. In 1711, the Great Boston Fire occurred. In 1721, a smallpox epidemic hit Boston. Over 1,000 people died in 1 year. On October 29th, an earthquake hit. It is the most remarkable earthquake ever known in New England. And it said Comer said this year, 1727, proved troublesome to the state of this colony, which was in a distressing condition. There never was so many supporters of the state taken away in 1 year as this remarkable year. It looks like a sad token of God's displeasure. And then it talks about Mary Dye. They said that thought that her husband murdered her. Another lady was killed by lightning. A child drowned. on August the 23rd. April 7th, 1728, 5 more citizens drowned in a sailing accident. In May of 1728, an exemption was made for Baptists and Quakers for relief from ministerial taxes if they lived less than 5 miles from their place of worship. But some of them were put in jail. And then on page 101, there was what they come to conclude was the Northern Lights. But this man, Comer, wrote about it this morning about an hour before day, being in bed and awake, observing a very uncommon light. I got up and finding it in the north, upon steady viewing at bottom of the horizon, there appeared a thick vapor, and above it a redness like unto fire, and in the middle 100 or more spears pointing upwards, extending towards the zenith. The whole body of the appearance had a slow motion towards the east. The whole face of the south was lighted as by the moon, which then had been set about 3 hours. And so all of these things happening started making people think about is this all the judgment of God? And you know, in our country, it seems like, especially over the past 25, 30 years, something like that, there's been an escalating of all kinds of disasters, natural disasters, hurricanes, tornadoes. Just in this past week, I was noticing, of course, I'm studying this and thinking about it as well, but all the fires, all the tornadoes, storms, protests. I seen a little thing that had been found around Pigeon Forge, and it was a page out of a Bible, out of the book of Joel, and it talked about the burnings of the land and all of this, and people were, and it was on, my wife showed it to me on Facebook or something like that, but people started commenting, and they started saying, you know, well, is this God trying to get our attention? Is this, God's always trying to get our attention.
Right.
And sadly, sometimes people don't even think about that until something really, really bad or tragedy comes. And so, you know, God has used things like that in the past to get people's attention. Sometimes people turn a deaf ear, and sometimes people do say, you know, I think God's trying to get our attention. And so what I'm saying is these patterns, if you study history, what you find is a history of revival. And as you study revival and you study history, what you find is this: revival never comes in the best of times. Revival always comes in the worst of times. In times of great tragedy, in times of great apostasy. And the Great Awakening is like that. The Second Great Awakening, there was a great revival right in the middle of the Civil War. I've thought about that a lot of times. If you were living in America in the middle of the Civil War, you'd probably think we were living in the last days. I mean, they had whole populations of men out of their towns that many times went off to war and never came back. Especially in the Southern Army, the Confederate Army, they had a great revival. Most of them that went off into battle pretty much knew they was going to die. And so there was a lot of getting right with God before they went, and they had a lot of preaching, they had a lot of revivals. There's a revival that centers around World War I, World War II, after Vietnam, even in the 70s in America. There's a great move of the Lord. And so revival doesn't come in the best of times. Revival comes in the worst of times. And so it'd be good for us to recognize that, because people are going to come and ask you, is there any hope for us? Can we have revival? Well, it certainly doesn't look like it. But if you study history, revival comes when times are very, very bad. People are away from the Lord. And there's been several times in our American history that God has given revival just when we needed it the most, when it seemed like we were too far gone. So when people ask you, can we have revival? I believe we can have revival. I do not believe that's out of God's ability to do that. I don't know if we will have revival or not, but I do believe we can have revival. 2 Chronicles 7:14, we hear that. You know, if my people which are called by my name shall humble themselves. And people say, well, that's to Israel, that's to the Jewish people. But Nineveh did that. I just preached through the book of Jonah, and I may have mentioned this, but they did that in Nineveh, and God gave them a revival. God spared them. God repented of overthrowing them. And so I do believe in revival. I believe we can have revival. I do not believe we can produce revival by just getting together and saying, hey, let's have revival. I mean, but we do that all the time. We have revival in our churches, but it's not Great Awakening revival. We have meetings in our churches most of the time. Charles Finney wrote a book, How to Have Revival. Well, he wrote that book during times when they were having revival. It was very common, and lots of people were getting saved. But there's been a lot of people since Finney's time that got that book and said, okay, let's do this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and followed that pattern in that book that didn't have revival. The best book I've ever read on revival was by Martin Lloyd-Jones, and it's entitled Revival. And he goes back and does a study on the great revival that took place in England in the 1860s, I believe it was. And the thing I took away from that book that he stressed over and over again is that revival is a sovereign act of God, meaning that God can send revival when He wants to. And most of the time when you study about the history of revival, it's when it least likely looks like that we can have revival. That's been the times that God would send revival. If you went back and you walked down through the streets of Nineveh before Jonah got there, I don't think anybody would have said, I think they're getting ready to have a great revival here. I mean, they were wicked. They were ungodly people, but God revived them. Well, what do we do about it? Ray Aiken, I heard him preach one time. He said this, in the worst of times, God needs the best of men. And as far as our lifetimes are concerned, we can probably say, well, we're in the worst of times. We need to make sure we're the best of men, that we're in a place where God can use us if God seemed fit to give revival. Either way, we're to be faithful to the Lord. So let's go over to chapter number 6. Maybe start there. Of all the men that we study about, read about, George Whitefield is my favorite. I just always like to read about him. I've got several books about him. I've got more books about him than I'll probably be able to read in my lifetime. I've got a book of his sermons. How would you like to have heard George Whitefield preach? By reading his sermons, you wouldn't read those and read somebody else's and say, boy, his are way up here. And everybody, I can see how if you just read his sermons and you didn't know who had written them, you wouldn't really see that much different from anybody else's sermons of that day. I mean, they're good, don't get me wrong, but it's not just the words that he said. But God used him greatly. Most people, even preachers, would probably be more familiar with Jonathan Edwards' messages or a lot of other preachers than they would George Whitefield's. But he was a prolific writer. I mean, there's a lot about him. Letters, sermons. He wrote a whole lot. But anyway, we'll start looking at George Whitefield and sort of carry that into next week. Chapter number 6 is the Great Awakening. And we've already touched on it a little bit. But we come here to what Dr. Beller calls our second key man. Number 1 was Jonathan Edwards. Number 2 is Shubal Stern. Or, I don't know why I said that. Number 2 is George Whitefield. I'm thinking ahead in my mind. But George Whitefield. And just let me give you some things about George Whitefield. George Whitefield was America's first celebrity. And I don't mean celebrity like we see on TV, but I mean he was the first person in America that was a household name. Even more so than, when we think about our history, we think about Thomas Jefferson, or we think about Benjamin Franklin, or we think about Patrick Henry, or men like that. But these men pretty much were localized. Patrick Henry, Thomas Jefferson, Virginia. Other men were known up north in Massachusetts, Connecticut. But the thing about George Whitefield is he traveled throughout all the 13 colonies. And so the others were more localized, known locally, but George Whitefield from north to south. And so he's the first person in America that would be a household name. That most people, if you mention the name George Whitefield, would have known that name. But he wasn't born in America, he was born in England. He was born in Gloucester, England in 1714. He entered Oxford when he was 18 years old. His family wasn't well off enough to send him there, so he entered Oxford as a servitor, which just means a servant. He was a servant to some of the other boys that was there in the college. So what would he do? He would clean their shoes. He would run errands. He would do little things like that. A servant of those who were more well off than him. He was saved while he was at Oxford, and I talked about his testimony, and I'm sure you've read it there. But before he was saved, he claimed to be a great sinner, and card player, Sabbath breaker, theater goer, things like that. He was saved at Oxford, I believe, when he was 22 years old. He was friends with John and Charles Wesley. There at Oxford, they had a club that they called the Holy Club. And what they would do, these were men that got together and they studied the Bible and they talked about Christ and the things of God. And they were called Methodists. Now, George Whitefield was not a Methodist. He was ordained an Anglican priest. John and Charles Wesley became the founders of the Methodist Church, but they called them Methodists because of their methods. And if you look on page 110, we'll give an example of what we mean by that. They were known as Methodists because they lived a very strict life. They lived by rules. They lived by discipline in their life. You look on page 110, it talks about George Whitefield. You come down to the bottom of the page, it talks about his early habits. He began a vigorous habit of self-denial. He says in his journal, "I always chose the worst sort of food. I fasted twice a week. My apparel was mean," which means didn't wear the best of clothes. "I thought it unbecoming a penitent to have his hair powdered. I wore woolen gloves, a patched gown, and dirty shoes. And though I was convinced that the kingdom of God did not consist in meat and drink, yet I resolutely persisted in these voluntary acts of self-denial because I found them in great promotion of the spiritual life." So it's not that he was doing that to be recognized, but he did that. It helped him in his spiritual life by his own testimony there. But one of the things I've always thought about George Whitefield on page 111, he says, "Above all," he says, "my mind being now more opened and enlarged, I began to read the Holy Scriptures upon my knees, laying aside all other books." And he carried that throughout his life, that he would read the Bible on his knees, praying for God to give him insight to His Word. He said, Dr. Beller said, of all those involved in the Holy Club, Whitefield had the best grasp on experimental religion and the grace of God given in salvation. He was ordained by Bishop Benson of Gloucester in 1736. And just think about this. This was a list on page 111, a list of convictions that George Whitefield would ask himself every day. He lived by this method. And also Jonathan Edwards, he made resolutions. I resolved to do this. I resolved to do this. These people, they took their spiritual life very, very seriously. And so some of the things he would ask himself every day: have I been fervent in private prayer? Have I used stated hours of prayer? Have I used ejaculation every hour? Short communicative prayers every hour is what that means. After or before every deliberate conversation or action, considered how it might tend to God's glory. After any pleasure, immediately given thanks. Planned business for the day. Been simple and recollected in everything. Been zealous in undertaking and active in doing what good I could. Been meek, cheerful, affable in everything I said or did. Have I been proud, vain, unchaste, or enviable of others? Have I recollected in eating and drinking? Have I been thankful, temperate in sleep? Have I taken time for giving thanks according to laws? Have I been diligent in studies? Have I thought or spoken unkindly of anyone? Have I confessed all sins? Can you imagine going through that list every day? That would tend to center your thoughts on Christ and His Word. Have I done these things? So they called them Methodists. They lived by a certain set of rules that they applied, and they were very serious about those things. So that's just some of the early life of George Whitefield. On page 112, it talks about his first sermon. And I think Brother Forbes was talking tonight about preaching your first sermon. Well, his first sermon, they said that he drove 15 people mad. And not getting mad, but mad in the sense of crazy. But he said, last Sunday in the afternoon, I preached my first sermon in the Church of St. Mary le Crypt, where I was baptized and also first received the sacrament of the Lord's Supper. You see, he's an Anglican. He was baptized as a baby. That's what he's talking about. Curiosity, as you may easily guess, drew a large congregation together upon this occasion. The sight at first a little awed me, but I was comforted with a heartfelt sense of the divine presence, and soon found the unspeakable advantage of having been accustomed to public speaking when a boy at school, and of exhorting the prisoners and poor people at their private houses while at the university. By these means I was kept from being daunted overmuch. As I proceeded, I perceived the fire kindled, till at last, though so young, and amidst a crowd of those who knew me in my childish days, I trust I was enabled to speak with some degree of gospel authority. Some few mocked, but most seemed for the present struck. And I have since heard that a complaint was made to the bishop that I drove 15 mad the first sermon. The worthy prelate wished that the madness might not be forgotten before next Sunday. And so he didn't condemn him over that, but he said, well, I hope it lasts till next Sunday. And it talks about his preaching. He preached different than the others, his style. It said his preaching startled England. His style and pathos were unique. His delivery was loud and gripping. It was his intense walk with God and passion for souls that came through to his hearers. And so George Whitefield, he was not the first. There were others that went to the fields and went outdoors before him. It talks about on page 113, it talks about Griffith Jones and Howell Harris. But at that time, what you see is some of these preachers, they didn't want them in the church, so what did they do? They went outside. And I think George Whitefield's first sermon, or one of his first sermons, was on a tombstone. Got up on a tombstone in a cemetery and began to preach. And it talks about that he went to the colliers, which means the coal mines. And he preached a message there, and he said he could tell the effects of it because troughs. You know, a coal miner's going to have a black face, and they would begin to cry, and it would make a mark down their cheeks, and he could see they were being affected. But he went out and he started preaching outside. You know, everything before that had been very cold, very formal. Like Jonathan Edwards read his messages, but George Whitefield, he's very, very animated. He's very loud. Of course, you have to be loud to be, if you're going to preach outside. Preaching outside is different. Maybe some of you have preached outside, maybe a camp meeting or something like that. It's not like a building. I mean, even in here, I can hear my voice coming back. But you get outside and you can raise your voice and you feel like, well, nobody can hear what I'm saying. I mean, it is very, very different. But they said that George Whitefield, he could preach outside and be heard a mile away. He was, the only way I can explain that is the Lord divinely helped him, because it's just different. I've been where there was a choir tried to sing outside, and man, they'll sing themselves till their voice squeaks, and it's just different. And so George Whitefield, he pioneered something. They didn't want him in the churches. They started to go outside and preach outside, and preach in a field. On page 114, it talks about his first attempt to do that. It said Whitefield would take to the fields, and these two Welsh evangelists would show him the way. The two men, Griffith Jones and Howell Harris, and they were very animated. If you study about church history, a lot of that animation of preaching, and what I mean, like somebody put their, we've all heard preaching where preachers do that. That is something that is attributed to the Welsh preachers. They were very fiery. They're very animated. The English tended to be more stiff, formal, but the Welsh had a different way that they animated in their talk. And so a lot of this is interesting, and where does that come from? But these two Welsh evangelists shown the way. It talks about Whitefield's first attempt at field preaching. His first attempt to do this was among the colliers at Kingswood near Bristol in February 1739. After much prayer, he went one day to Hannah Mount, and standing upon a hill began to preach to about 100 colliers upon Matthew 5:1-3. The thing soon became known. The number of hearers rapidly increased till the congregation amounted to many thousands. His own account of the behavior of these neglected colliers who had never been in church in their lives is deeply affecting, having, he writes to a friend, no righteousness of their own to renounce. They were glad to hear of a Jesus who was a friend of publicans and came not to call the righteous but sinners to repentance. And so from the very outset of his ministry, it's very, very different, very animated. It's hard to preach with many notes if you're standing on a tree stump. And so his style of preaching would be more not reading from a manuscript, but what's called extemporaneous. Take a message, take a text and read that text and preach out of that text. And so he preached a whole lot on you must be born again. And a lady asked him, said, why do you preach so much that we need to be born again? He said, because you need to be born again. And I know you've heard that. But these early habits, the Baptists, now Jonathan Edwards was not a Baptist, George Whitefield is not a Baptist, but the Baptists embraced them. Because George Whitefield was a renegade. What he was doing was out from under the authority of the Anglican Church. He was preaching in a way, he was preaching in a manner that was not approved of. They didn't want him in the churches, but he went ahead and done it anyway. And, we can sort of, when you see somebody that the government might say, don't do that, but it needs to be done and done in a right manner, and it's gone ahead and done anyway. Well, the people they recognized the hypocrisy of it all, and so they embraced George Whitefield, the way he did things, and so his life is very, very interesting. Next time, we'll go further and talk a little bit more about George Whitefield, but that's sort of just getting into it. If you haven't read, or if it's been a while since you've read chapter number 6, I would encourage you to go back and sort of read over that again. Maybe you've got some highlights, and we'll talk about that next week and give some examples of that, but just continue to talk about George Whitefield. Of course, last time I messed up, I said this would be the last night, but actually next Thursday will be our last time before Christmas. And so I'll stop off right there. I think I got started a little bit off time, but just probably be a good place to stop off, but just leading into starting talking about George Whitefield. Hope everybody's safe going home, and Lord willing, we'll see you back here on next Thursday night.